In the autumn of 1878, the bustling German immigrant neighborhood of Over-the-Rhine, in Cincinnati, Ohio, spoke of 12-year-old Klara Schmidt in hushed, anxious whispers. This pale, observant child could, within seconds, name the day of the week for any date in recorded history. She could memorize lengthy conversations verbatim after a single hearing and could state the exact number of cobblestones between any two storefronts on her street. What a modern doctor might identify as a remarkable neurological condition, the people of 1878 saw as either a divine gift or something profoundly unsettling. But when Klara began using her talents to uncover long-buried secrets, predict devastating accidents, and describe the intimate details of crimes no living person should have witnessed, the community's awe curdled into fear. By the following spring, 4 men would be dead, a prominent family would vanish in the dead of night, and Klara Schmidt herself would disappear without a trace. All that remained was a simple, cloth-bound ledger filled with columns of numbers that no one had the courage to decipher. The residents of Over-the-Rhine did not yet understand that Klara's gift would unravel a web of deceit, betrayal, and crime that had been masterfully concealed for years. They did not know that her mathematical certainty would soon become their community's most terrifying truth. Cincinnati's Over-the-Rhine district in 1878 was a vibrant world of red brick breweries, tightly packed tenement houses, and the rich sound of German accents mingling with English in the humid Ohio air. The community of nearly 10,000 German immigrants had carved out their own piece of the old country along the Ohio River, complete with lively beer gardens, traditional butcher shops, and the comforting rhythms of life transplanted to American soil. The men found work in the breweries, Christian Moorline, Hudipole, and a dozen smaller operations that made Cincinnati a brewing capital, while their wives cultivated small gardens with vegetables that reminded them of their homes in the Black Forest. Conrad and Elsbeth Schmidt had arrived from Saxony in 1865, dreaming of a prosperous new life with their infant daughter, Klara. Conrad secured a steady position as a cooper at the Becker Brewery, a large operation that supplied lager to the city's thirsty populace. Elsbeth took in sewing and alterations to supplement their income, her fingers working by gaslight long after Klara was asleep in their modest apartment on Vine Street. The Schmidts were ordinary in every way, except for their daughter. Klara had been born during the turbulent Atlantic voyage, arriving a month early and so frail that the ship's surgeon doubted she would see land. Yet she survived, remaining a slight, pale child with enormous blue eyes that seemed to absorb the world around her with an unnerving focus. As a toddler, she rarely made a fuss, content to sit quietly in a corner, watching and listening as the adult world bustled around her. By the age of 5, her parents noticed her unusual abilities. She could perfectly recite conversations she had overheard days before, mimicking the exact tone and cadence of each speaker. She counted everything: the stitches in her mother's mending, the steps from their apartment to the market, the precise interval between the brewery whistles that framed the workday. When Conrad taught her simple arithmetic, she grasped complex concepts with astonishing speed, solving problems in her head faster than he could calculate them with a pencil and paper. Initially, the German community regarded Klara's talents with a mix of local pride and apprehension. The elderly widow Muller, who told stories of folkloric curses from her grandmother's village, would make a protective sign whenever Klara's calculating blue eyes fell upon her. But Pastor Braun, the hardy Saxon minister of their small Lutheran parish, proclaimed Klara's gifts a blessing from God, a sign of divine intellect in their new American home. The winter of 1877 had been exceptionally cruel, with temperatures so low the Ohio River froze over, a rare event. Brewery workers gathered around pot-bellied stoves, their breath fogging the air even indoors, as their wives stretched scant resources through the long, frozen months. It was during this period of isolation that Klara's abilities began to reveal a darker side, though no one yet grasped what was unfolding. Klara had a habit of sitting by the parlor window, observing the daily routines of their neighbors with the same intense concentration she applied to her sums. She saw patterns not only in numbers but in human behavior. Mr. Fuchs always walked to the cooperage via the same route, taking exactly 312 steps, except on Thursdays, when a different path required 351. Mrs. Bauer hung her laundry in a particular order, but whenever her husband worked a night shift, the sequence was completely altered. These were dismissed as the eccentricities of a peculiar child until Klara began to announce her findings in ways that made the adults profoundly uneasy. The shift from curiosity to fear began on a bleak November morning in 1878. Klara was at the kitchen table, methodically eating her oatmeal while her mother packed her father's lunch pail. Suddenly, she looked up and stated, "Mr. Adler will not return from the brewery this afternoon. He will pass away at exactly 22 minutes past 3 o'clock." Elsbeth nearly dropped the tin pail. "Klara, in Goda's Namen, what a dreadful thing to say. Why would you imagine such a thing?" Klara's blue eyes remained fixed on her mother's face. "He has been secretly drinking from a small flask for 19 days. Yesterday, his consumption was 4 times the usual amount. His steps were unsteady, 318 instead of his usual 312. When a person's patterns change by more than 8%, a significant event occurs within 48 hours. Mr. Adler's pattern changed by 11%. The calculation is clear." Conrad, buttoning his heavy coat, froze and stared at his daughter. Mr. Adler was known to drink, but so were many men in Over-the-Rhine. The idea that Klara had been counting his steps and tracking his drinking was disturbing enough, but her calm, mathematical certainty about his death sent a chill through her parents that had nothing to do with the Ohio winter. "You must not speak of such things, Klara," Conrad said, his voice firm. "It is not right for a child to talk of death." Klara merely nodded and returned to her breakfast, but her parents exchanged troubled glances above her head. They were used to her unusual observations, but this felt different, darker and more absolute than her typical numerical pronouncements. At precisely 3:22 that afternoon, Mr. Adler collapsed in the brewery's cellar. The official cause of death was a massive heart attack, which Dr. Weber attributed to advanced alcoholism. The men who found him recalled that he had seemed agitated for weeks, drinking more heavily and showing signs of extreme stress. But what truly unsettled everyone was the timing. Klara Schmidt's prediction had been correct to the minute. News of Klara's grim forecast spread through Over-the-Rhine like a winter contagion. Some called it a morbid coincidence, but others remembered the pale girl with the analytical eyes and began to wonder what else she had noticed from her silent perch at the window. The Schmidt family became the subject of whispers and wary glances on their way to church and at the market. Pastor Braun, who had once celebrated Klara's gifts, now seemed hesitant. When Conrad sought his counsel after Sunday service, the pastor's usual warmth was gone, replaced by deep concern. "Conrad, my friend," he said, his Saxon accent heavy with worry, "perhaps it is best if young Klara spends less time at the window and more time in prayer. The Lord grants us many gifts, it is true, but the devil can twist even the purest talents to his own dark ends." This advice deeply troubled Conrad. A practical man, he had always put more faith in the craft of barrel making than in divine mysteries. Yet, he could not ignore the chilling accuracy of Klara's prediction. That night, he sat his daughter down. "Klara, you must tell me the truth. How did you know about Mr. Adler?" Klara looked at her father, her expression as calm and detached as ever. "I watch, I count, I remember." Mr. Adler's behavior changed in a predictable sequence. When a person increases their alcohol intake by 42% over a 19-day period while decreasing their food consumption by roughly 25%, cardiac failure becomes inevitable. "I calculated the most probable time of the event based on his age, build, and observable symptoms." Conrad felt his blood run cold. His 12-year-old daughter spoke like a physician, or something else entirely. "But Klara, how could you know all these things about his habits?" "I observe everything, Papa. Every day, every person, every pattern." Klara's voice was matter of fact, but something in her eyes made Conrad profoundly uncomfortable. "Would you like me to tell you about the other calculations I have made?" Conrad quickly shook his head. He did not want to know what else his daughter had calculated about the lives and deaths of their neighbors. But as he tucked Klara into bed that night, he felt his family was teetering on the edge of something far more sinister than a simple mathematical prodigy. The November winds howled outside their small apartment, muffling the sounds of the city and creating a world of shadows where secrets could be kept, and a young girl could watch, undetected. Klara lay still in her bed, her mind processing the day's data, calculating probabilities that no child should ever comprehend, and certainly no child should ever wish to know. In the weeks that followed Mr. Adler's death, the mood in Over-the-Rhine changed like the smoke from the brewery's smokestacks, drifting and settling in unexpected places. Klara continued her daily vigil at the window, but now her parents watched her with a growing sense of dread as her blue eyes tracked the comings and goings of their neighbors with an unnerving, mechanical precision. The daughter who had been their quiet pride had become a source of constant, unspoken fear. The community of German immigrants was bound by necessity. The men depended on one another for their livelihoods, their wives for comfort during the long, humid summers, and their children played together in the narrow alleys between the brick tenements. But Klara had never truly been a part of this world. While other children chased hoops and shared secrets, she preferred to sit alone, counting, calculating, and observing her surroundings with that disquieting focus. Elsbeth soon noticed that Klara's observations were becoming more personal and more alarming. The child might casually mention that Mrs. Hoffman had been secretly meeting Mr. Steiner, the cooperage foreman, in a disused storage loft on Thursday afternoons for the past 8 weeks, or that the Keller family had been burying small, cloth-wrapped parcels in their yard every other Sunday after services. When Elsbeth asked how she could possibly know such things, Klara would simply explain that she had observed the patterns and calculated the outcomes. "People believe their actions are a secret," Klara said one December morning while methodically spreading jam on her toast. "But they follow patterns, just like multiplication tables. Mrs. Hoffman tells her husband she is visiting her cousin on Thursdays, but she takes 142 steps toward the cooperage instead of the 411 steps to her cousin's house. The Kellers bury their parcels exactly 65 centimeters apart in a precise grid. They think no one sees, but I am always watching." Conrad had heard enough. That night, after Klara was in bed, he spoke urgently to his wife. "Elsbeth, this cannot go on. The girl is becoming unnatural. Children should not see such things, let alone speak of them as if they were sums in a schoolbook." Elsbeth nodded, her hands shaking as she darned one of Conrad's work aprons. "I am frightened, Conrad. Not of Klara, but of what people will say. The neighbors already look at us with suspicion. Widow Muller made the sign against the evil eye when she saw me at the market yesterday. And Pastor Braun has not called on us since Mr. Adler's death. Their fears were validated 3 days later when Klara made another of her mathematical pronouncements. She was helping her mother chop vegetables for soup when she suddenly paused, her knife hovering over a carrot, and looked up with that familiar, analytical expression. Mrs. Hoffman will be discovered tomorrow at 10:30 in the morning. Her husband will find her with Mr. Steiner in the storage loft. It will be violent. Elsbeth dropped her knife with a clatter. Klara, Neen, you must not say these things. But Klara continued with the same cool certainty she applied to her arithmetic. Mrs. Hoffman has been arriving at the loft 9 minutes earlier each week for 8 weeks. Mr. Steiner has been staying 42 minutes later each day. Tomorrow, Mr. Hoffman will return from his delivery route 53 minutes early because his wagon is developing a crack in its left front axle. I have observed the wobble increasing for 13 days. The intersection of these 3 variables makes the discovery a certainty. Conrad, who had been listening from the doorway, felt his stomach clench with dread. His daughter was not merely observing their neighbors, she was predicting the course of their lives with terrifying precision. Klara, how can you know about Mr. Hoffman's wagon? I count the rotations of the wheel as it passes our building. On December 1st, it wobbled 58% of the time. Today, it was 73%. Tomorrow, the axle will be weak enough to force him to abandon his route and return 53 minutes ahead of schedule. The following day unfolded exactly as Klara had calculated. August Hoffman discovered his wife, Liesel, in a compromising embrace with the cooperage foreman, Marcus Steiner. The ensuing confrontation left Steiner with a broken jaw and several fractured ribs, while Liesel was beaten so badly that Dr. Weber had to be called. The scandal sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community. But what disturbed people more than the affair was the creeping realization that little Klara Schmidt had somehow foreseen the entire sequence of events. The story spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. The pale girl with the mathematical mind had not only predicted Mr. Adler's death but had now also foretold the Hoffman-Steiner scandal with chilling accuracy. People began to whisper in earnest about the strange child who sat at her window, watching, calculating, and knowing things that no good Christian child should know. The Schmidt family found themselves utterly isolated. Old friends now crossed the street to avoid them. Children were forbidden from playing anywhere near their building, and even the local merchants began to serve them with a tense, barely concealed suspicion. Conrad's position at the cooperage became precarious. His co-workers regarded him with a mixture of fear and resentment, and Marcus Steiner, recovering from his injuries, made it clear through intermediaries that Conrad's presence was a constant, unwelcome reminder of the scandal. Klara, however, seemed oblivious to the hostility that now surrounded her. She continued her daily observations, her mathematical mind processing data and calculating probabilities with unwavering precision. She filled her cloth-bound ledger with numbers, dates, and notations that her parents were now too afraid to read. The sight of their 12-year-old daughter hunched over her calculations, her pen moving in neat columns, filled them with a nameless dread. As the harsh winter settled over Cincinnati, their isolation became complete. The Over-the-Rhine district, once a comforting haven, now felt like a prison. Conrad began to contemplate the unthinkable. Leaving Cincinnati, abandoning the life they had painstakingly built, and starting anew somewhere far from the whispers, the fear, and the terrible, unerring accuracy of their daughter's predictions. But Klara had not yet finished her work. The worst was still to come, and her methodical mind was already processing the data that would lead to the community's darkest secrets. As the harsh Ohio winter began to release its grip, replaced by the damp chill of early spring, Klara's cloth-bound ledger grew thicker with her meticulous entries. The book had become her constant shadow, its pages filled with increasingly intricate calculations that her parents could no longer pretend to comprehend. They saw glimpses of charts tracking the movements of their neighbors, tables of figures, and detailed sketches of the Over-the-Rhine streets, marked with symbols and precise measurements. The community's apprehension toward Klara had now hardened into outright fear. Mothers would pull their children inside when the Schmidts walked by. Shopkeepers served them in tense silence, and Pastor Braun limited his interactions to a stiff nod during Sunday service. Yet Klara's isolation only seemed to hone her observational powers, as if the absence of normal childhood distractions allowed her unique mind to focus more intensely on the mathematical undercurrents of human life. Dr. Elias Weber, the community's physician, had become increasingly intrigued by Klara's abilities. Unlike the superstitious gossip of his neighbors, Dr. Weber approached the matter with scientific curiosity. He had been educated in Heidelberg before coming to America and had read articles on unusual mental faculties. When Conrad Schmidt visited him in private, desperate for a medical explanation for his daughter's condition, Dr. Weber agreed to see Klara. The meeting took place on a rainy March morning in Dr. Weber's office above the apothecary on Race Street. Klara submitted to the doctor's questions and tests with the same methodical precision she applied to everything, answering each query with startling detail, her blue eyes fixed on some invisible point of calculation. "Klara," Dr. Weber said in his carefully articulated English, "your father tells me you can foresee events. Can you explain how you do this?" Klara looked at the doctor with her unnerving focus. "I observe patterns and calculate probabilities from the data. People believe their choices are their own, but they follow predictable mathematical progressions. When I have enough data, I can forecast their actions with a high degree of accuracy." Dr. Weber leaned forward, fascinated. "Can you provide an example?" Klara opened her ledger, turning through pages of neatly written numbers. "Widow Muller believes her secret is safe, but her pattern is clear. Every Monday and Thursday for 10 weeks, she has walked to the church at exactly 4:10 in the afternoon. But instead of going inside to pray, she continues to the parsonage, where she remains for precisely 52 minutes. Pastor Braun's patterns have also shifted. He has been purchasing extra wine and coffee, and his evening sermons have been shorter by an average of 12 minutes on Mondays and Thursdays. The statistical correlation is undeniable." Dr. Weber felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The implication about the pious pastor and the grieving widow was scandalous, but the clinical way Klara had documented her evidence was profoundly disturbing. "Klara, how long have you been watching people like this?" "Always," she answered simply. "Since I was very young. But I only began the calculations when I learned arithmetic. The patterns became visible then." After the examination, Dr. Weber spoke privately with Conrad and Elsbeth. His medical background told him Klara's condition was a rare function of the brain, not something supernatural, but he had no clinical framework for what he had witnessed. "Your daughter's mind operates differently," he explained. "She processes the world in a way that is almost computational. In my professional opinion, this is a medical phenomenon, not what the neighbors are whispering about." But even Dr. Weber's rational perspective could not lessen the dread that clung to Klara's predictions. 2 days after the visit, she made another of her calculated announcements. "There will be a fire at the Gottlieb house on Saturday night. It will start at 9:53 and will consume 2 adjacent tenements before the fire company can contain it. Mr. Gottlieb will not get out. Conrad felt the familiar, icy chill that always accompanied his daughter's prophecies. Klara, you cannot say such things. How could you possibly know there will be a fire? Klara consulted her ledger. Mr. Gottlieb has been drinking cheap spirits mixed with varnish thinner for 15 days. I observed him buying both in quantities that far exceed their use in his cabinet making. His wife took the train to Cleveland to visit her sister yesterday, which is consistent with the pattern of spouses leaving before a major domestic incident. The stovepipe in his workshop is damaged. I calculated the structural weakness based on the pattern of soot deposits and the angle it leans. The probability of a fire is 94%. Elsbeth began to cry silently. The dispassionate way Klara discussed such a horrifying event, as if human suffering were just another variable in an equation, frightened her more than any talk of curses or devils. This was her daughter, but she no longer recognized the cold logic in Klara's voice or the mechanical way she processed human tragedy. Conrad made a choice that would torment him for the rest of his days. He decided to warn Jakob Gottlieb, hoping that a timely intervention might save a life and perhaps prove that his daughter's strange gift could be used for good. He found Gottlieb in his workshop on Saturday evening, reeking of the spirits Klara had mentioned, his movements clumsy and slow. Conrad's warning was met with a belligerent sneer. Get out of here, Schmidt, and keep your Hexenkind, your witch child, away from my affairs. She knows nothing, but something in Conrad's desperate plea must have registered, because Gottlieb gruffly promised to be careful with his stove. Saturday night arrived with an unseasonable dry wind blowing from the west. At exactly 9:53 p.m., flames burst from the windows of the Gottlieb house. The fire, fed by the dry wind and the varnish in the workshop, spread with horrifying speed, engulfing not only Gottlieb's building but the 2 crowded tenements on either side before the volunteer fire brigade could get their pumper working. Jakob Gottlieb's body was found in the charred remains of his workshop, where he had apparently knocked over a lantern while in a drunken stupor. The precision of Klara's prediction, down to the exact minute, sent a wave of panic and revulsion through Over-the-Rhine. Conrad's attempt to warn Gottlieb had been overheard by neighbors, and the story spread that Klara had not only predicted the fire but also its specific timing and terrible outcome. The community's fear metastasized into open terror, and the Schmidt family became complete outcasts. But for Klara, the fire was merely another event to be logged in her ledger. She noted the correlation between her prediction and the actual outcome, adjusted her formulas based on the observed variables, and began processing new patterns with the same dispassionate precision that had made her prophecy a reality. The worst part was, she wasn't finished. The days after the Gottlieb fire plunged Over-the-Rhine into a state of paranoid suspicion. Klara's prediction had been too exact, too detailed, and too horribly accurate to be dismissed. 3 families, the Vogels, the Ritters, and the Bauers, had lost everything in the inferno, and the community struggled to care for the displaced while grappling with the terrifying reality of Klara Schmidt's prophecies. Conrad's position at the cooperage was now impossible. His co-workers shunned him, their conversations ceasing the moment he entered a room. Marcus Steiner, the foreman, had made it clear through mutual acquaintances that Conrad was no longer welcome. The mathematical precision of Klara's predictions had transformed her from a neighborhood oddity into a figure of pure dread, a reputation that now stained her entire family. Klara herself seemed oblivious to the rising tide of hostility. She continued her daily work, filling page after page of her ledger with calculations that grew ever more complex. She had begun to create what looked like intricate probability charts, tracking dozens of variables simultaneously and generating forecasts that extended months into the future. Elsbeth was now afraid to even glance at her daughter's book, terrified of what Klara might be calculating about her own family. The child who was once her quiet joy had become a source of unrelenting anxiety. Klara's clinical discussion of tragedy, her dispassionate observations of her neighbor's most private moments, and her mechanical processing of events that should have elicited tears or horror, all fed a growing fear that something vital had been broken or was missing in her daughter's soul. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday morning in late April. Klara was at her usual post by the window, observing the street with her customary intensity, when she looked up at her mother, her blue eyes devoid of emotion. "Mama, the pattern is wrong today." Elsbeth, kneading dough for the day's bread, felt her hands go still. "What do you mean, Klara?" Klara consulted her ledger, her fingers tracing a line of figures. "Every Tuesday for 13 weeks, Widow Muller has walked to the parsonage at exactly 4:10. But today, she left her house at 3:38 and walked toward the canal instead. Her posture indicates extreme distress. Her stride has shortened by 14%, and her breathing is shallow. This suggests she is preparing for a final act." The cold, analytical way Klara described the widow's apparent despair filled Elsbeth with a profound horror. "Klara, you must not speak of such things. Mrs. Muller is a good woman. She would never." "The mathematical probability is 89%, Klara interrupted, her tone as neutral as if she were reciting a multiplication table. Individuals who dramatically alter long-established behavioral patterns while exhibiting physical signs of acute stress typically make an irreversible decision within 3 hours of the pattern's disruption. Mrs. Muller's pattern changed 51 minutes ago." Elsbeth felt the room spin. The knowledge that her 12-year-old daughter was calmly predicting a neighbor's suicide with the certainty of a mathematical proof was more than she could endure. She abandoned her dough and ran to find Conrad, who was in the small yard behind their tenement, attempting to find a moment of peace by mending a broken chair. "Conrad, you must come. It is Widow Muller. Klara says she is going to the canal to harm herself. We have to do something." Conrad looked at his wife's panicked face and felt the now familiar dread settle in his heart. They found Klara still at the window, making new notations in her ledger as if she were documenting a scientific experiment rather than a human tragedy. "Klara, tell me exactly what you saw." Klara looked up from her calculations. She deviated from her Tuesday pattern by 32 minutes. Her physical indicators suggest severe emotional crisis. Based on historical data regarding behavioral disruption, the probability of self-harm is 89%, with the highest likelihood occurring between 6 o'clock and 8 o'clock this evening. Conrad made a choice born of desperation and a grim acceptance of Klara's abilities. He left the apartment at once and hurried toward the Miami and Erie Canal, following the path his daughter had indicated. He found the elderly widow standing on the towpath, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, staring into the murky water with an expression of utter desolation. "Mrs. Muller," Conrad said softly, approaching her slowly. "Are you all right?" The old woman turned, her eyes swollen with tears. "Conrad, what are you doing here?" I was worried about you. You have seemed so troubled." Mrs. Muller's face collapsed into a mask of grief. "I cannot bear it anymore, Conrad. The shame, the whispers, the knowledge that everyone knows about my sin. Pastor Braun says God will not forgive me, but I cannot stop what I feel for him." It is better to end it all than to live with this disgrace. Conrad realized with dawning horror that Klara's observations about the widow and the pastor had been true, and that the poor woman was indeed contemplating suicide to escape the scandal. He spent the next hour talking gently to Anna Muller, walking with her along the canal, convincing her that shame was a burden, but not one worth dying for. When he returned home that evening, exhausted and emotionally drained, he found Klara making the final entries for the day in her ledger. Mrs. Muller did not proceed with her plan, she noted clinically. The intervention has altered the probability. I will need to add a new variable to my model to account for third-party interference in future calculations. Conrad stared at his daughter, his heart a cold stone in his chest. Klara had somehow observed and calculated a suicide attempt before it happened. And now, she treated his intervention as nothing more than a new piece of data for her equations. The realization that his daughter was not just predicting tragedies but studying human suffering with the detached curiosity of a scientist filled him with a horror he could no longer contain. That night, as Klara slept soundly in her small bed, Conrad and Elsbeth made the decision that would irrevocably alter their lives. They had to leave Cincinnati. Klara's abilities, whatever their origin, had made their life in Over-the-Rhine impossible. But more frightening was the growing certainty that their daughter was not just observing and calculating human behavior. She was losing all connection to the emotional reality of the pain she predicted. They began to make secret plans to leave Ohio, to find a place where Klara could live without being feared as a monster, and where her extraordinary mind might find a less destructive purpose. But Klara had not finished her calculations. The most devastating revelations were yet to come. As Conrad lay awake that night, listening to the distant sounds of the city, he could not shake the feeling that his daughter's mathematical mind had uncovered secrets far deeper than infidelity and suicide. The precision of her observations, the clinical way she spoke of human despair, and the increasing complexity of her calculations all pointed to the terrifying possibility that Klara had been watching and recording far more than anyone knew. And the most frightening part was that she was still calculating. The revelation that would expose the deepest, darkest secret of Over-the-Rhine came on the first day of May, 1879. Klara had been immersed in her ledger for days, creating complex charts that tracked the movements and behaviors of nearly every adult in their immediate neighborhood. Her parents were quietly packing their few belongings, hoping to slip away before Klara's next prediction could shatter more lives. But that morning, as the spring sunlight filled their small kitchen, Klara made an announcement that would tear the community apart. "Papa," she said, looking up from her ledger with her unnervingly calm blue eyes. "I must show you something. My calculations have revealed a pattern that explains everything." Conrad, who had been dreading this moment, sat down heavily across from his daughter. Klara opened her ledger to a section filled with detailed maps, charts, and columns of numbers that looked like the work of a professional detective, not a 12-year-old girl. "For 31 months, I have been observing and recording the behavioral patterns of 52 adults in our community," Klara began, her voice even and precise. "At first, I believed the patterns were unrelated, but when I analyzed the data as a complete set, I discovered correlations that indicate a sophisticated criminal enterprise." Conrad felt the blood drain from his face. "Klara, what are you saying?" Klara pointed to her charts with the methodical confidence of a professor. 9 men in our community have been meeting in secret every Friday at midnight in the sub-basement of the Becker Brewery. I calculated their movements based on observed deviations from their stated routines, inconsistencies in their alibis, and the physical evidence of their gatherings. She indicated a detailed map of the neighborhood, marked with routes and times. Mr. Steiner tells his wife he is playing cards on Friday nights, but he leaves the tavern at the same time as the other 8 men and walks to the brewery using a route that avoids all the main thoroughfares. This pattern has been consistent for 31 months, with only 4 exceptions, which correlate to documented illness or family emergencies. Conrad stared at the map, recognizing the names Klara had listed. Marcus Steiner, the foreman, August Hoffman, whose wife Steiner was having an affair with, 2 cousins of the late Jakob Gottlieb, and several other respected men in the community. Klara, how could you know about secret meetings? I observe everything, Papa. Every night, every shadow, every deviation from the established norm. Klara turned to another page filled with figures. But the meetings are not the most significant finding. My calculations indicate that these 9 men have been involved in the systematic theft of grain and brewing supplies from multiple breweries, with estimated losses of nearly $60,000 over 31 months. Conrad's hands began to shake. The sum Klara mentioned was a fortune, more money than most families in Over-the-Rhine would see in 10 lifetimes. How could you calculate such a thing? Klara's explanation was delivered with the same mathematical certainty she applied to all her work. I noticed discrepancies between the brewery's reported grain purchases and the actual beer production figures, which I calculated based on observed shipments, dray schedules, and waste removal. The difference pointed to systematic theft. I then had to identify the perpetrators. She pointed to charts tracking the financial habits of the 9 men. These men all displayed patterns of spending that were inconsistent with their known incomes. Mr. Hoffman purchased a new wagon for cash. Mr. Steiner sent large sums of money to his brother in Buffalo. I observed him at the telegraph office 15 times, sending funds. The pattern repeated across all 9 men. Conrad realized he was looking at the evidence of a massive criminal conspiracy, uncovered by his own daughter's obsessive observations and relentless analysis. But Klara wasn't finished. The operation required inside knowledge of brewery inventories and access to shipping manifests, she continued. My calculations indicated the involvement of someone in a position of authority. The patterns all point to Mr. Becker himself, the owner of the brewery, as the organizer of the entire ring. This final revelation struck Conrad like a physical blow. Mr. Becker, the brewery owner who had given him his start and was seen as a pillar of the community, was allegedly the mastermind of a major criminal enterprise. The precision of Klara's analysis, the mathematical certainty of her conclusions, and the mountain of evidence she had compiled through months of silent observation all pointed to a truth that was both unbelievable and terrifying. Klara, these are terrible accusations. Are you absolutely certain? Klara consulted her ledger one last time. The mathematical probability is 97%. But Papa, there is one more thing. Something that explains why Mr. Becker has been trying to force us out of the community. Conrad felt his chest tighten. What do you mean? Mr. Becker knows that I see everything. He has been watching me watch him. 4 weeks ago, he walked past our building twice late at night, stopping for 21 minutes each time, as if trying to determine if I had discovered his secret. His behavior indicates he suspects I know about the theft operation. The realization that Klara's abilities had not only uncovered a criminal conspiracy but had also made her a target filled Conrad with a terror he had never known. His daughter's obsessive, calculating mind had revealed secrets that powerful men would surely kill to protect. Klara closed her ledger and looked at her father, her blue eyes as clear and cold as ice. Papa, my calculations indicate that our family is in imminent danger. Mr. Becker and his associates cannot allow me to continue my observations. The mathematical probability of them taking direct action against us is 87%, with the highest likelihood occurring within the next 48 hours. Conrad finally understood. Klara's last prediction wasn't about a fire, a scandal, or a suicide. It was about their own survival. Her mathematical mind had uncovered a truth so dangerous that it made their continued existence in Cincinnati impossible. That evening, Conrad made the decision that would save his family. Taking the detailed evidence in Klara's ledger, he went to Dr. Weber under the cover of darkness and shared his daughter's terrifying discoveries. The physician, already unsettled by Klara's abilities, was staggered by the mathematical precision of her criminal investigation. "Conrad, if what Klara has calculated is true," Dr. Weber whispered, examining the ledger by the light of his office lamp, "this is one of the largest criminal conspiracies in this city's history. And more importantly, if Becker suspects Klara knows, your family is in mortal danger." Dr. Weber agreed to help them escape Cincinnati at once. Using his professional connections, he arranged for Conrad to receive an urgent job offer from a cooperage in distant St. Louis, providing a plausible reason for their sudden departure. They would leave that very night, before Klara's 48-hour prediction could come to its grim conclusion. As the Schmidt family loaded their few possessions into a wagon provided by Dr. Weber, hidden in the darkness of a back alley, Klara made one final observation that would haunt Conrad for the rest of his life. "Papa, in approximately 7 months, the theft ring will be discovered by other means. Mr. Becker will face justice, but 4 of the 9 men will not survive the investigation. The mathematical probabilities are quite clear." Conrad shuddered as he helped his daughter into the wagon. Even as they fled for their lives, Klara was calculating the future consequences of the conspiracy she had exposed. Her prediction would prove uncannily accurate. By the following winter, a federal investigation would unravel the entire operation. Mr. Becker would be arrested and convicted, and 4 of his accomplices would die under violent or suspicious circumstances before they could be brought to trial. But on that dark May night in 1879, as their wagon rumbled over the cobblestones of a sleeping Over-the-Rhine, Conrad could only think of how his daughter's extraordinary, terrifying mind had both saved their lives and destroyed the only home they had ever known in America. The Schmidt family vanished from Cincinnati, leaving behind only whispers, unanswered questions, and a legacy of fear. The Schmidt family vanished from Cincinnati in the early hours of May 2, 1879, leaving behind only hushed rumors and a community gripped by fear. Dr. Weber informed inquisitive neighbors that the family had received an urgent summons to return to Saxony to care for a gravely ill relative. However, the few who bothered to check noted that no ship passenger logs from that year bore their names. What the residents of Over-the-Rhine never discovered was that Conrad, Elsbeth, and Klara had indeed traveled west to St. Louis. There, Conrad found work at a large cooperage near the riverfront, as Dr. Weber had arranged. The physician had sworn to keep their location an absolute secret, understanding that Klara's extraordinary mind would always make her a target for those with secrets to hide. In St. Louis, the Schmidt family attempted to build a new, anonymous life, far from the whispers and terror that had driven them from Cincinnati. Conrad found solace in the familiar, steady work of his trade, while Elsbeth slowly tried to re-establish the simple domestic routines that had been shattered by her daughter's unsettling predictions. But Klara herself remained unchanged. Her mathematical mind continued to observe, calculate, and record the patterns of human behavior with the same mechanical precision that had made her both a pariah and a prophet. Dr. Weber maintained a discreet correspondence with the family for several months. In November of 1879, A letter arrived from Conrad confirming the chilling accuracy of Klara's final prediction about the Over-the-Rhine conspiracy. Just as she had calculated, federal investigators had uncovered the massive theft operation. Mr. Becker was arrested and convicted of embezzling nearly $60,000 from multiple breweries. Marcus Steiner, his primary accomplice, was found dead in his boarding house room in what was officially ruled a suicide, though many suspected foul play. 3 other members of the ring also died within weeks of the investigation's launch, one in a violent brawl that was dismissed as a drunken dispute, and 2 others from a sudden, virulent illness that Dr. Weber noted bore the hallmarks of certain fast-acting poisons. Klara's mathematical analysis of the criminal enterprise had been correct in every detail, including her forecast that not all of the conspirators would live to face justice. The precision of her calculations, made months in advance and from hundreds of miles away, reaffirmed what Conrad now understood about his daughter's remarkable and terrifying gift. The German quarter of Cincinnati slowly healed from the scandal and tragedy of 1879. The federal investigation brought unwelcome scrutiny, but it also purged a level of corruption that had been quietly eroding the community for years. New families moved into the tenements left empty by death and hasty departures, and the tight-knit neighborhood gradually rebuilt itself on a more honest, if warier, foundation. But the story of Klara Schmidt, the pale girl with the calculating blue eyes who could predict death and uncover secrets through pure observation, became a dark piece of local folklore. Parents used her tale to warn their children about the dangers of prying, while adults would sometimes look at their neighbors and quietly wonder what secrets lay hidden behind the ordinary facades of their lives. Dr. Weber's final letter to the Schmidt family was dated spring of 1880, nearly a year after their flight from Cincinnati. In it, he reported that life in Over-the-Rhine had largely returned to normal, but that Klara's story was still told in hushed tones among the older residents. He also shared a disturbing detail that had emerged from the federal investigation. The government agents had examined Klara's cloth-bound ledger, which Conrad had left with the doctor as evidence. They discovered that it contained mathematical calculations extending far beyond the theft conspiracy. Klara had apparently been tracking and analyzing the behavioral patterns of the entire community, creating detailed profiles of dozens of families and forecasting future events, disputes, illnesses, and financial troubles with startling accuracy. The federal investigators, men trained in criminal analysis, were both impressed and deeply unsettled by the sophistication of her methods. "Your daughter's mind functions in a way that our best detectives can only dream of," Dr. Weber wrote, quoting one of the lead agents. "But I confess, Conrad, I am grateful she is far from here." The precision of her observations and the certainty of her predictions represent a form of knowledge that I fear is too dangerous for any community to hold. The last known mention of Klara Schmidt in any historical document comes from a brief notation in the records of the Washington University Mathematics Department in St. Louis, dated 1881. A Professor Altschuler noted that his special student, a young woman of unprecedented ability in statistical analysis and behavioral prediction, had ceased her studies after her family decided to relocate again for private reasons. After that entry, Klara Schmidt and her family disappeared from history as completely as they had vanished from Cincinnati on that dark spring night. What became of the girl who could calculate human behavior with mathematical precision is unknown. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that the human mind remains one of our greatest and most frightening mysteries, capable of developing extraordinary abilities that defy easy explanation. In 1879, Klara Schmidt's logical approach to human behavior was seen as something otherworldly, either divine or demonic. Today, Science might suggest conditions like Savant syndrome or hyperthymesia can create minds that process information in ways that seem supernatural to the uninitiated. The case of Klara Schmidt demonstrates that sometimes the most terrifying truths are not born of ghosts or curses, but from the relentless application of cold, hard logic to the messy patterns of human lives. In a world where we cherish the belief that our secrets are our own, the existence of a mind capable of such precise observation and calculation is a stark reminder that privacy may be nothing more than an illusion, and that the patterns we think we hide so well may be painfully obvious to anyone who knows how to look and how to count.